Washington Journal continues.
General Wesley Clark is our guest for the next 45 minutes here on the Washington Journal. He joins us from Little Rock, Arkansas. And General, with so much going on in the world, from ISIS in Syria to unrest in Europe with tensions in Ukraine, Taliban concerns, is there an area of the world right now that most concerns you from a national security perspective and U.S. interests?
Well, Ukraine is the real center point for my concern right now.
And why is that, sir?
Because in Ukraine, Putin is challenging the international order. He seized Crimea through use of the Russian military. The United States and Germany basically stood by, encouraged the interim leaders in Ukraine not to resist this in effort to avoid a wider conflict. And then Putin began his operations in eastern Ukraine. So he's taken a sovereign state, Ukraine, whose sovereignty was guaranteed by the signers of the Budapest Memorandum in 1994 when Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons. And he's invaded. He's put Russian military in there. The forces in there are under the command of the Russian General Staff. General Gerasimov is actually the man taking orders from Putin. He's the chief of the Russian General Staff. So there's not much that we don't know about what's happening in eastern Ukraine. The question is the world prepared to admit it, recognize the consequences, and do something to stop it? And it's the most important national security issue facing us, because if we allow Putin to overturn international law and violate borders and threaten the security of nations in Eastern Europe, then the structure of the international community is at risk in a way that it's not at risk by what's happening elsewhere in the world yet.
You've argued in a piece in USA Today recently that the United States should arm Ukraine. What do you say to opponents of that effort who say that that would only escalate tensions, that it would drive Putin away from the negotiating table?
Well, first of all, it's not tension in eastern Ukraine. It's actually aggression in eastern Ukraine. There are between 10 and 14,000 Russian troops in eastern Ukraine. Some are in advisory roles, some are commanding these separatist units. There are some Russian forces in there, the artillery, the electronic warfare, the air defense is all manned by Russian forces. There's 40,000 Russian troops on the borders standing by and ready to intervene. So this is not tension. This is active conflict in there. And if you're going to have a diplomatic settlement, you've got to close the military option off to Putin. He's got to understand he can't continue to execute warfare on the ground and deny it in the media.
You're the former NATO Supreme Allied Commander in Europe. Talk about the effectiveness of NATO these days, specifically when it comes to deterring Russian aggression.
Well, Ukraine's not a member of NATO, so technically NATO doesn't have any responsibility for deterring Russian aggression in Ukraine. But what NATO must do is provide a credible deterrent for its NATO members, and they feel the Baltic states, Romania, other states in Eastern Europe feel threatened by the strategy they see unfolded by Russia in Ukraine. That is to say, you can infiltrate special forces, you can create civil disturbances, you can seize administrative headquarters, you can send your intelligence operatives in to hire a bunch of thugs, you can import people from Russia and claim that they're local citizens, mercenaries essentially being paid a couple of $100s a day, send them in weapons and let them create mayhem, and then demand to put Russian forces in as peacekeepers. It's a pattern for aggression. And when the peacekeepers fail and the separatists fail, the Russians just use their own artillery and use their own forces to achieve their military objectives or attempt to do so. So the question is that if we let it unfold in Ukraine, how safe are the NATO member states? Remember, NATO has always been a deterrent alliance. That is to say, we made the consequences of aggression incalculable for leaders in the Kremlin. There were nuclear weapons stored in Europe. There was a linkage to the United States strategic nuclear deterrent. We had strong U.S. forces deployed in West Germany along the front line. So this wasn't a tripwire strategy. There was a credible deterrence. The Russians could have certainly launched an attack, but they couldn't predict the consequences. And that incalculability is the critical part of deterrence. So what Putin has done is created a strategy which seems to erode the deterrent. That is to say, what the East Europeans fear is that these Russian tactics would enable Russia to spark a riot, let's say, in some Eastern European country, so-called demonstrators seize government buildings, and then local people, supposedly, would suddenly have arms and defend the demonstrators seizing the buildings, and suddenly Russia would say, you're mistreating Russian-speaking citizens, and it's our responsibility and duty as Mother Russia to protect them. We're putting our forces in, and then dare NATO to do something about it. So this is a very worrisome scenario in Eastern Europe, and that's eroding NATO's deterrent.
We're talking with General Clark for the next 40 minutes or so here on the Washington Journal. You can join the conversation by calling in. Republicans can call at 202-748-8001. Democrats, 202-748-8000. Independents, 202-748-8002. We'll also look for your tweets and your emails as well to journal@c-span.org. I want to turn, General, to Syria and Iraq. You're a man who has experience building a winning air campaign. Is the current air campaign that the U.S. Is employing against ISIS, is it working?
Well, it is working to some extent. It's certainly inflicted losses. It's done economic harm to ISIS. Remember, ISIS claims to be a state. It has finances, it has government, it has structure. It's attempting to impose an extremist interpretation of Sharia law. So it's not just a bunch of fighters hiding out, and so therefore it is vulnerable to air power to some extent. Now it is going to take the work of the local allies on the ground, the Peshmerga from Kurdistan, the Iraqi forces trained by the United States and re-equipped by the United States to do something effective against ISIS. You can't take it out from the air, but you can certainly cripple it and hobble it and cause it to do a lot of things it wouldn't like to do to protect itself from the air, and that's what the United States is doing. It's a strategy that buys time, inflicts damage, and helps contain the threat of ISIS.
Reports that Iraqi troops and allies on the ground are starting the effort to retake some of the cities that ISIS has taken. Some reports that Mosul, the second largest city in Iraq, there could be an effort there later this year, even this summertime. When Iraqi troops and these allied troops on the ground do that, do they start losing the advantages of that U.S. air support? And what can the United States do during those operations?
Well, the United States can certainly pre-plan targets to go after. The United States can put unmanned aerial vehicles overhead and use those to facilitate real-time targeting. The United States also could put some special operations forces who are able to call in airstrikes up there alongside the Iraqi troops. I suspect that at some point we'll do that. That's certainly the issue that's live right now, and we've got to do it in a way that is effective and it's also safe for the U.S. forces on the ground. One of the keys in this operation is this is a long-term struggle against ISIS. It's not going to be decided by a single battle. It's unlikely it's going to be decided during the incumbency of President Obama. And so it's very important that we do this in a very efficient way without overly risking our own forces. So air power has worked beautifully so far. No losses that have been reported on air power, and it has effect on the ground. We've got to be careful also with when we start putting special forces forward. We don't want to end up in a position where we've got U.S. boots on the ground fighting directly against ISIS, because that serves as a huge recruiting magnet for ISIS.
We're talking with retired General Wesley Clark. He's currently a senior fellow at UCLA's Burkle Center. His newest book is Don't Wait for the Next War, a strategy for American growth and leadership. He's here taking calls and questions from our viewers for about the next 35 minutes. We'll start with Larry in Sterling Heights, Michigan. Line for Independence. Larry, you're on with General Clark.
Good morning. I got one question to Mr. Clark, and a real nice question. If you remember the terrorists in Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia and Kosovo, and they bombarded for 78 days, Mr. Clark. Why don't you bomb now Russia? Why don't you bomb Russia? Russia doing the same thing. And ISA, you can do nothing. Just you guys talk about. You did the same thing what you do in Yugoslavia. You try to bombard the ISIL. You can do nothing. Answer me that one. I will appreciate it.
General Clark, the caller looking for more robust efforts against both Ukraine and ISIS.
Well, I think to go to Ukraine first, the United States has not made the decision to supply lethal armaments to Ukraine, and I think that would be the next step. It should be done in conjunction with a renewed diplomatic effort with more U.S. involvement in the diplomacy. In other words, it's the way we stopped the fighting in Yugoslavia in 1995. We went to Slobodan Milosevic, the Serb dictator, and we simply said, here it is. Here's the plan, 51-49 split of Yugoslavia, and if you accept it, you'll get some sanctions relief, and if you don't, we'll lift the arms embargo imposed on the Muslims, and we'll also use U.S. air power to strike your forces. And so he got both a carrot and a stick. And I think that's the kind of diplomacy that makes a difference in Eastern Europe. And if it's applied correctly with the right backing from West Europe, then it could halt the fighting in Ukraine. But we've got to be prepared to provide the lethal equipment that the Ukrainians need, and we've got to get this working quickly. So I think that's the preparatory steps long before we talk about any U.S. air power involved in there. There's really no need for that at this time. And with respect to ISIS, I think the U.S. air power is making a difference. It's unlikely it's going to be decisive. And all the generals know that. If you ask the generals, they're going to all tell you that you've got to have boots on the ground to defeat ISIS. But what is not being discussed in the ISIS dialogue is what comes next. And so it's not just a matter of killing people. You've got to replace ISIS with effective governance in the region. And as the United States is working up its military plan, we've got to be working behind the scenes, as we are, trying to improve the effectiveness of the Iraqi government, its inclusiveness, and its ability to then govern the territories that are recaptured from ISIS. If that's not done, then we can't really succeed against ISIS. That leaves the quandary of Syria, where we're striking ISIS forces in Syria. Bashar al-Assad is he's still in power in Damascus. I don't know whether you'd call him the legitimate ruler or not. The president several times has called for his removal as someone who's lost legitimacy because he's killed his own people. But he does occupy the seat of government, has control of the armed forces, and is assisted by Russia. And there is no other effective authority. We're talking about creating an authority. We've armed and supported a moderate Syria opposition that's had some difficulties in there. But we've got to, at some point, address what happens in Syria as well if we're going to go after ISIS. And that includes not only attacking ISIS, but what's the status of future governance in Syria.
General Clark, you mentioned generals. The prospect of U.S. boots on the ground. It's not just military officials, politicians talking about this as well. On the Sunday shows yesterday, Rick Perry was one of those who brought this up. He was on CNN's State of the Union. Here's a bit of what he had to say about U.S. boots on the ground against ISIS.
You need to look back and you see the opportunities that we missed. Funding and giving weapons to the Syrian rebels could have stopped ISIS before they ever got out of Syria. Then as they moved into Iraq, we had the opportunity with the Peshmerga to fund them and to give them heavy weaponry, and we failed at that. So the options we have left are not the best ones, but having a coalition with the Jordanians, with the Saudis, with the other Middle Eastern countries.
Which is what the Obama administration is doing.
But they're the lesser of options. And I'll also suggest to you, we're going to have our military actively engaged with those special operators from those other countries to eliminate the ISIS threat. And so this administration is not, it's exactly what it means. I mean, there's no, I'm not trying to parse the words, it's exactly what we should have.
General Clark, your thoughts on Texas Governor Rick Perry's statements about how we go after ISIS?
Well, I think we are going to probably have to provide some special forces folks who can call in airstrikes when the Iraqi armed forces move. But we need to do the best we can in training and not fall back on a reliance on U.S. forces here, because ultimately the Iraqis themselves, and I mean not only the Shia Iraqis but the Sunni Iraqis, have to live in their own country. They have to provide security in a very rough neighborhood. We've tried to train the Iraqi military before. The effort was corrupted by Prime Minister Maliki and the forces that he represented in Iraq. So that effort's being put back together again. Hopefully it'll work better this time.
Let's go to Alan, who's been waiting on our line for Democrats. Brooklyn, New York. Alan, you're on with General Wesley Clark.
Good morning. I'm honored to have a chance to even address General Clark, who has a wonderful record of service to our country. Considering the Monroe Doctrine from the 1800s, where the U.S. made it clear that we felt we had zones of influence in our hemisphere, and the history of Russia having borne the brunt of territorial pain during World War II and loss of both military and civilian life during that war, do you think if most Americans had a clear understanding through their elementary and college education of the geography and history of Russia, that they would have supported the kind of needless provocation that we engaged in by trying to make Ukraine not only independent and free, but to sort of seem to absorb it into the NATO alliance in a formal way that would foreseeably pose a threat to the psychology of Russia and make them feel that they had to push back the way they are now? I'm not justifying violence or aggression by the Russians, but I'm saying from the standpoint of hindsight and historical perspective, do you think it was wise for us to try to gain that little marginal advantage of identifying Ukraine with NATO as opposed to just letting them be independent, that this kind of problem might have followed? And
General Clark, let you respond.
Well, I think it's an important question, and I hope the American people will understand that people in Eastern Europe want to be associated with NATO because they fear Russia. They knew how Russia would behave. I was in Bulgaria in 1997 as NATO commander, and the foreign minister told me, she said, today Russia's weak, someday it'll be strong, and before then Bulgaria has to be in NATO. The people in Romania told me the same thing. I went to Ukraine. I was told the same thing in Ukraine. We didn't make Ukraine an independent country. Ukraine has been independent. It had a seat in the United Nations, even when it was part of the Soviet Union. And when the Soviet Union fell apart in 1991, Ukraine was there. It was a nuclear state at that point, and we signed a document protecting, saying that we would respect its borders and its independence. So did Russia, by the way. But in Russia, when the Soviet Union fell apart, the power ministries, the KGB, the Foreign Intelligence Service, the Interior Ministry, the Armed Forces, they never fell apart. They struggled through, they formed the basis of, and on top of that was this thin veneer of elections. And underneath it was corruption in the power ministries. And so it may have looked like it was going to become a capitalist country, and certainly a lot of people made a lot of money out of it. And the Communist Party, at least so far as Marxism-Leninism, passed away. But the relationships persisted, and the 19th century view of Europe as a geostrategic battleground persisted. Western Europeans don't see it that way. They see countries as opportunities for economic growth and trade and commercial relationships. They don't see Eastern Europe as a chessboard to be fought over. But the power ministries inside Russia do see it that way, and they have ever since the end of the Cold War. So, you know, the Monroe Doctrine was 19th century. This is the 21st century. We don't want spheres of influence. What we want is stability, respect for international law and borders, and freedom, the right of people to choose their own form of government and their associations. So it's the Ukrainian people's choice to be associated with the West rather than with Russia. Russia's made that choice for them in a way by this attack. Before this attack last year, I think the majority of Ukrainians would have said, why do we want to be affiliated with NATO? But now they are agreeing with the others in Eastern Europe who say, we need protection from Russia. So I think what we have to do as the United States is our historic role. We're the leaders of NATO. We're the leaders who've always helped assure the stability of Western Europe. We fought 2 world wars to assure that there would be powers friendly to us in Europe. And so we need to take the lead in the diplomacy to end this conflict and restore Ukraine's territorial integrity and its right to freely choose with whom it will associate.
Wesley Martin on our Twitter page writes in, as we're having this conversation, negotiation is the way to stop the fighting in Ukraine. Maybe a little less meddling from the West would help. We're talking with General Wesley Clark, the former NATO Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, about national security and U.S. foreign policy. He's currently a senior fellow at UCLA's Burkle Center, and his newest book is Don't Wait for the Next War, a strategy for American growth and leadership. Joe's up next, West Valley, New York, line for Democrats. Joe, good morning.
Good morning.
Go ahead, Joe.
General. Hey, I'm a Navy veteran. And full disclosure, I see a lot on Fox News. How do you feel about these generals coming on TV that work for, defense contractors and all that? Thanks a lot.
Well, I think that that it's important to hear from retired officers. I don't think these officers that are working on Fox News or others, I know most of them. They're honorable men. They have integrity. They're telling you what they feel. Yes, they're working for defense contractors because that's what they're good at. And when you get out of the military, in your near 50s, it's pretty hard to say, okay, I've been in the military, I was a general or a senior officer, and I think I'll now become a lawyer or doctor or an accountant. It's pretty hard to change your profession totally and forget about what you've done. So I have a lot of sympathy for these guys who are on television and talking on Fox News. We don't always agree on everything because we're all beneficiaries or victims of our own experiences. But what I've seen in my military career is that if you're going to have effective diplomacy, you have to back that diplomacy with power. And sometimes economic strength is not enough. Sometimes it has to be backed by forces and the threat of force. That's how we brought an end to the fighting in Yugoslavia in the 1990s. And I'm afraid that's what's going to be required in Ukraine.
And General, do you want to talk about your own career track after you left the military and after your presidential run in the 2004 election?
Well, I thought that I could be one of these people who could go my own way, so I became an investment banker, and I've worked with a lot of big firms. I've got my own investment bank, but to be honest with you, it's still a struggle for all of us who've gotten out. I mean, basically, we are who we train to be, and I've been associated with the armed forces since I went to West Point at the age of 17, and most of the other generals are just like me, and at our heart, what we're really good at is talking with troops and working military strategy and operations, and then we're all out in the private sector trying to apply those skills. So I'm in oil and gas and wind and solar, electric power, investment banking, international business all over the world. We've got our own investment bank. We're trying to put together some funds to invest smartly, but my heart goes out to people in Eastern Europe who are suffering and under fear. I was in Ukraine a few weeks ago, and I was asking people, why do they stay in Eastern Ukraine, and they're under attack there? Why are these people living in basements and so forth? And as the Ukrainians explained, said these are very poor people. They have nothing. They live in the summer off their vegetable gardens, and they can what they can grow, and they have a little bit of cash sometimes from retirement monies, and they have their home. If they leave that, if it's destroyed, if it's looted, they have absolutely nothing and no support. And so that's the reality of life in eastern Ukraine. There's a lot of poor people, and we're not so far removed from that. My grandparents lived off their vegetable garden. They canned things and lived on during that. So I've got a lot of sympathy with people like this. And that's why all of us, I think, are still able to speak on television, because we went into the armed forces, because we believed in things, we followed it, and we believe in the ideals, the great ideals of America. And we hope we're wise enough and strong enough to live up to them.
Let's head to West Jefferson, North Carolina. Wayne's waiting on our line for Independence. Wayne, you're on with General Clark.
Good morning, General Clark.
Morning.
Is the liberal press, the liberal Democratic Party, and academia going to quit ignoring the elephant in the room, a failed president who's indecisive, weak, and not capable of being a president? When is everybody going to see the elephant?
Well, you know, in the American political system, we have different perspectives, and you're certainly entitled to your perspective, but some people see it differently. Now, the way I see it is President Obama came to office and he's tried very hard to right the course of American foreign policy. I'm one of those people who believe that the invasion of Iraq was unnecessary. It was a strategic mistake, and it's unleashed a huge wave of instability in the region, which we're still dealing with. We've never really gone back and sought accountability for the mistakes of those that were in office during that period. But what he's tried to do is back us out of Iraq and the Middle East by taking down the forces, by trying to leave in place governments that work, and so I'm in favor of that. He's advocated strategic patience. That is to say, we can't simply rush in every time we see something happening in the world we don't like. We know we're the best people in the world, but other people don't always agree with us. And somehow we've got to live in what is an ever smaller world, and we've got to bring together those people who don't always agree with us. So, you know, I respect your point of view, but there is a legitimate alternative point of view, and it'll be decided in the election. You know, there's as many people out there in the press attacking the president as there are supporting him. Not all the media is liberal, and if you're watching Fox News, you probably know it's the largest and most successful network. It has a very loyal group of people who watch it, and they have their views, but other people have their views too. In democracy, we all have to respect that.
Artie's waiting in New Orleans, Louisiana. Line for Democrats. Artie, good morning.
Yeah, good morning, and good morning to General Clark. I'm a 25-year retired military veteran, and I served 2 tours in Vietnam, and I was in combat. We had over 350 combat missions. And my problem is this. 90% of the equipment that I've been seeing on television that these guys in ISIS are riding up and down the streets in our own equipment that was abandoned by the Iraqis. Now, my question to you as a general, why don't we establish what we had in Vietnam they call free fire zones? If these helicopters or drones are flying out there and spot our former equipment headed in one direction, why can't we destroy it? And another thing, I'm glad you made the comment about the president's efforts in this area. You know, the president is doing what he can to keep this country out of chaos and destruction. People in the other parts of this world are waiting to destroy us. Thanks to our Congress, thanks to Fox News, Obama is not weak. And I think the whole problem is, sir, is that we have this thing called bigotry. And this is bigots doing all that talking. Thank you for listening.
General Clark, on the questions of the military equipment first.
Well, first of all, thanks for your service. Secondly, we do try to destroy that equipment when we can attack it, but we're not necessarily doing it by helicopter. We've got some Apache helicopters over there. They're being used more for close-in defense than they are for long-range strike, and so when you're flying at 20,000, 25,000 feet and you see a tank down there, maybe you take it out, but maybe you have other more important targets. But we have taken out some of this equipment that's been captured.
Charlene's up next. Bowie, Maryland, line for Democrats. Charlene, you're on with General Clark.
Good morning, C-SPAN America. General Clark. Could you speak a little bit about the natural gas in Ukraine, or what resources Russia is trying to secure, and connect the dots for us with regards to this pipeline, this alliance with China? Is that why Russia is trying to secure Ukraine for the natural resources?
And General, that goes along with Michael's question on Twitter, who just a minute ago asked, is Europe willing to give up its economic ties to Russia amid what's going on? If you want to take those.
Yeah. Well, first of all, Europe's not willing to give up its economic ties, and no one wants it to. What we want to do is restore normalcy in the area and respect for Ukraine's boundaries. I think Putin and maybe the people around him see the world as a chessboard, and they see that their real threat is not NATO. They know NATO is not going to attack Russia. They see that they need to reestablish the Soviet space in order to have sufficient resources to face China. So China has always been the concern of leaders in the Kremlin, going back to Stalin. And so they know that with the growth of China, its technology, its unitary state, its lust for natural resources, its facing toward Mongolia and Siberia, that's their natural adversary, and to be strong enough, they've got to have Ukraine. Ukraine's got 45 million people, modern technology, coal and gas. Now, how much gas it's got remains to be seen, because a lot of that is in the eastern sector. We can't get at it, and because of the what's happened in the last 10 years with technology, we have reason to believe that there's a lot of gas in Ukraine that could be developed and not imported, but it's located in Ukraine, but we can't get in there to explore for it. Ukraine is it's where the pipelines go through, and so a lot of Europe's gas is coming through Ukraine. So when Putin threatens to cut off gas to Ukraine, he's threatening Europe. So Europe has a deep relationship with Russia. First of all, Russia is a market for a lot of capital goods produced in Western Europe, and particularly in Germany, and it's natural that they want to retain that market. Secondly, it's a source of raw materials, including natural gas, that are necessary for Europe. So everybody would like normalcy restored, but that's really up to Vladimir Putin. And he's playing the game. He believes at least the way I read him, he believes that he can juggle the Europeans, string them along, and still regain enough of Ukraine to make it amenable to Russian leadership. What would he like in Ukraine? Well, one of the plans that's published shows him taking the Donbass, Crimea, Odessa and the coast, and linking up with Transnistria, and leaving behind a very small rump state that could be called Ukraine, but would be without a seacoast and without most of its natural resources in the east, and even without some of its farmland in central Ukraine. And so that's not a very appealing prospect for most Ukrainians. I was surprised when I've been over there 6 times. I've always surprised by the strong sense of nationalism in Ukraine. We might consider them just like Russians, but they don't consider themselves like that. And so they're fighting for their own identity. When you talk to the Ukrainians, they'll tell you they've tried to do this before. They tried to have an independent state when Russia, Tsarist Russia, fell apart and they were crushed by the communists. They'll tell you about the millions of Ukrainians that were starved and shot and murdered by the communists in the 1930s. They'll tell you about resistance to the Soviet Union after World War II. So there's a strong sense of nationalism in Ukraine.
And when was the last time you were in Ukraine?
A pattern of Eastern Europe. I was there in mid-February.
And where did you go visit when you were there in February?
I was in Kiev, and then I went down to a provincial city, Dnipropetrovsk.
And we're talking with General Clark for about the next 10 minutes or so here on the Washington Journal. Miroslav's waiting to join the conversation. Paterson, New Jersey, line for independence. Miroslav, good morning.
Yes, Simon. Good morning, John. Please don't cut me off. I want to ask a question to Mr. Wesley Clark. Mr. Clark, you hear me?
Yes,
I do.
Miroslav, we hear you.
I was born in Bosnia, Herzegovina. I'm Serb. I was growing up with my good Muslim and my good Catholic, what you call them Croats. And now what you did over there, you and President Clinton and Miss Madeleine Albright and the rest of you friend people over there, what you did in Yugoslavia, you choose all enemy Serbs. You bombed all Serbian places. And on the end, you take a half of Serbia and you give it to Albanian country. And now you know pretty good what's going on over there. All Albanians, they want to leave Kosovo. Please, Mr. Clark, I'm not against Albanian. I'm not against Muslim. I'm not against Croats. I grew up with them. They all my friends. But you see what kind of situation you people did over there. Call Mr. Clinton, Mrs. Albright, Mrs. Clinton, prepare a few $1 trillion and go over there, help those Albanians stay in their own country. That's all what you did over there in Yugoslavia. That's
Well, General Clark, I want to give you a chance to respond.
Okay, well, I mean, we didn't do that over there, actually. We had nothing to do with the outbreak of the fighting. If you go back at the historical record, when Tito died, what happened is that the ethnic conflicts that had been suppressed under communist rule began to surface again. And when the Soviet Union and Marxism, Leninism failed, Slobodan Milosevic, who was the man in charge in Yugoslavia by that time, used nationalism, ethnic nationalism, Serb nationalism, as a binding force for his own authority. And in so doing, he alienated the other groups. And so the Slovenians, the Croatians, the Bosnian Muslims, they were all afraid. Montenegro is even independent now. And of course, when Milosevic created the Serb state in Bosnia, he took the Yugoslav National Army, he pulled all the Bosnian Serbs, put them into the Serb army, Republika Srpska army, and used it to try to overrun Bosnia, supported by the Yugoslav National Air Force and other Yugoslav assets. So actually, Slobodan Milosevic created this war. Between 100 and 200,000 people died through some brutal ethnic cleansing. Most of it was done by Serbs. Some was done by Muslims, but it was initiated by the Serbs, and they committed by far the greatest proportion of the atrocities. And the United States and Europe stepped in to try to stop the fighting. 2 million people were displaced from their homes. Countries in Western Europe were spending billions of dollars supporting refugees, and it was disrupting all of Europe and the dreams of European integration. So, yes, please stop the fighting, and that's really what's happening in Ukraine today. This is a war of aggression. It's got to be stopped. And just like in Ukraine today, European leaders spent 2.5, 3 years jawboning with Slobodan Milosevic while he said, oh, it's not me, it's these Bosnian Serbs, I don't have anything to do with it, and he lied, I can't control General Mladic, and so forth. It was all a sham, and we finally got it stopped through American leadership. So, but I wouldn't blame the Clinton administration for what's happened there. You can blame the Clinton administration for stopping the fighting, but starting it, that rests with Slobodan Milosevic. I've met lots of Americans of Serbian descent. They're fine people. They're very patriotic. They love their country like Americans of Polish descent and Hungarian descent do. But particularly in the case of Serbian Americans, I found so many who just didn't follow the events closely in the 1980s, the late 1980s, and they didn't understand. Yes, you grew up with Muslims and Albanians and many other people. It's the way the Balkans were. But the hatreds were fomented as a tactic of leadership begun by Slobodan Milosevic.
General,
I'm sorry, that's the way I see it.
In terms of how the world responded to the atrocities in that situation, what parallels would you draw to the world responding to the atrocities that we're now seeing via social media from ISIS in this current conflict in Syria and Iraq?
Well, I hope that the world is responding, and we do see those atrocities, but it's a little bit different. The atrocities in the Balkans, the locking up, the starving, the massacres of these Muslim men at Srebrenica, for example, were designed for military purposes. General Mladic didn't want any resistance from these people, and he wanted to eliminate potential opponents. In the case of ISIS, the atrocities are perpetrated for different reasons. They're not worried that these various ethnic groups and religious factions would actually fight ISIS. They want to create atrocities. They want to horrify, they want to terrorize, and they want to recruit. They want potential recruits to feel a pornographic thrill when they see these atrocities on YouTube. And they want to shock the West into sending its infidel soldiers into the region so they can use those soldiers as a recruiting magnet to create something that's a religious war, when in fact it's just a gang of terrorist thugs who are masquerading, using religion as a pretext and trying to create a greater conflict to serve their own ends. So it's an entirely different purpose of the terrorizing, but yes, it's horrible and we should stop it.
Got time for just a few more calls with General Clark joining us from Little Rock this morning. Steve's been waiting in Hendersonville, North Carolina. Line for Republicans. Steve, go ahead.
Yes, just first off, as far as ISIS is concerned, if we don't consider that a holy war, we may well lose it. This business that it's just a bunch of thugs is crazy. Now, as far as Iraq is concerned, the thing about Iraq was, regardless of how you feel about it, in 2008, it was a basic success on its way to becoming a democratic country. And we should have left the residual force there. After all, what would have happened if we didn't have a residual force in South Korea? And I think we made the same mistake in Ukraine. And I often wondered why we didn't have some kind of residual force in Ukraine.
General Clark.
Well, we never had any force in Ukraine, so that wasn't the case. With respect to the residual force in Iraq, I wasn't there. I wasn't on the inside of the negotiations. I know it's a partisan issue. I know Republicans feel that the president didn't try hard enough. I spoke to the ambassador. I was over there at that time when we were still arguing those things. The ambassador told me he was working it really hard, and we expected to have a residual force of some type. We were waiting for the same kind of status of forces agreement that we had in South Korea that let U.S. servicemen who got in trouble be tried under U.S. law. And we could never get that through. And one of the reasons we couldn't get it through is Iran did not want it to go through. Iran was always pulling the strings behind Maliki in Iraq. There was a strong Iranian influence, and you say it was on the road to success. It may have been more peaceful outwardly, but it was on the road to Iranian domination. Now, had we been able to keep forces in there, yes, I think that would have been appropriate, but we couldn't keep them in there without the right legal status for those forces. Just couldn't do it. Now, with regard to the holy war concept, there's a lot of talk going back and forth blaming the president for being politically correct by trying to say that ISIS is not Islamic. Here's the thing. What they would like to do is they would like to make it a holy war. They would like to be able to say they represent all Muslims and try to bring 1 billion Muslims against others for their own purposes. So they actually don't. And if you look at what they've said and you look at their actions, they aren't in keeping with the precepts of the Quran. They violate those precepts. The murder of innocents, the punishment, the tortures, and so forth, that's not in the Quran. And so when we say that they're Islamic, we're actually doing them a favor. What we're doing is we're lumping them together with the rest of the Islamic world. Our success against them is going to depend on depriving them of recruits. And so when we call them Islamic and we echo that across the land, and there are young men in America and elsewhere who they may be Muslim, and they may hear it as a holy war. And if they hear it as that, maybe they would sympathize with ISIS. We don't want that. We want ISIS to be branded as terrorist renegades from Islam, not as representatives of Islam.
And General Clark, I have just a minute left here, but want to end where we began with Ukraine and Russia and give you a chance to comment about the death of the liberal politician and Putin critic that is making news all around the world. Here's the headline from the Financial Times on the march that happened yesterday on the death of Mr. Netsov.
Well, I think, you know, in the media we have to, in the West, we always try to do he said, she said kind of journalism. So the West is in the media is waiting breathlessly to find out, has the police investigation yielded anything? And thus far, the government has suggested that maybe he was murdered by Chechens, maybe by Ukrainians, maybe by members of his own group. But people in the region understand that he was likely murdered by Russian intelligence agents acting on instructions of Mr. Putin. He was about to publish an expose of Russia's involvement in Ukraine. And that's the secret, the dirty secret, that Putin's been trying to keep from the Russian people. From the time he started this operation, he's tried to deny that Russia's forces were in there. So they've intimidated the mothers of the slain soldiers. They've had what are called mobile crematoria, driving around the battlefield, policing up bodies, throwing them in the crematoria, and disposing of the evidence of Russian participation. I was told when I was in Ukraine in November that the Russian city of Rostov, which is located relatively near Ukraine, had declared that it was itself off limits due to plague, so that trucks carrying the bodies of Russians dead on the battlefield in Ukraine could be brought into Rostov, and these bodies could be buried there and disposed of. So there's a massive subterfuge underway. Mr. Putin had the motive for the murder. He had the means for the murder. It bears all the hallmarks of a Russian intelligence hit squad done to send a very strong political signal to the opposition to stop unmasking Mr. Putin. And that's the way it'll be read. Whether we're in the West sophisticated enough and able to see it for what it is or not, it's a test of whether we can deal with Russia's tactics of hybrid warfare.
General Wesley Clark is the former NATO Supreme Allied Commander. We always appreciate your time on the Washington Journal.
Thank you very much.
And the General's book is Don't Wait for the Next War. Came out at the end of last year. We'll be joined next on the Washington Journal by Utah Congressman Rob Bishop. He's the new chairman of the House Natural Resources Committee. And later in our weekly Your Money segment, we break down the Department of Homeland Security as we talk about funding, staffing, and the agency's history. We'll be right back.